Thanks for being here, Gillian, and take it away.
Thanks for inviting me, Mike. Once upon a time, when I started my master's degree in psychology, I felt imposter syndrome, as many people do. In addition to the usual reasons, I had taken exactly 3 psychology classes. I had left behind a successful career in a different field, and I was 10 years older than most of my classmates. So I was often thinking, did I make the right decision? Should I be here? But something unexpected happened that made a real difference to how I felt on campus. And that was that I developed a relationship with a lady who worked at a hot dog stand. This is a stock photo, that's not her. So most days on campus, I would walk between the research lab and my supervisor's office. And when I did that, I would pass a hot dog stand. And I would smile at the lady who worked there and she would wave at me. And something about seeing her regularly and having this mutual recognition made me feel like maybe I did belong on campus. So later, when I started my PhD in Liz Dunn's Happy Lab, Liz asked me what made me happy, and I told her about the hot dog lady. And so we decided to study these kind of minimal social interactions, but instead of studying it at a hot dog stand, we first ran a study at Starbucks. So we recruited people as they approached a busy Starbucks on the weekend, and we gave them a gift card to spend on their purchase. But there was a catch. So we gave them instructions on how to interact with the cashier when they went into Starbucks. So some people, we asked them to be as efficient as possible, to have their money ready and to avoid unnecessary conversation. And we tried to suggest that this would be a positive thing, that the cashier would appreciate that because they're just trying to get through their shift. Other people, we said, try to have a genuine social interaction with the cashier. So make eye contact, smile, have a little chat. And lots of people said they do this all the time anyway, so we just asked them to do it even more than they usually did. So people went into the store, followed the instructions, bought their coffee. When they came out, we asked them to fill out a few questions. And what we found was that this little manipulation seemed to have a pretty big impact. So people were in a reported more positive affect, less negative affect, and greater feelings of connection when they'd had a little chat with the cashier. Now, this was back in the day when we were satisfied with a sample size of 25 per cell. Those were the good old days, bad old days perspective. But luckily, this effect has been replicated several times since then. So right around the same time, actually, that we were doing this work, Nick Epley and Juliana Schroeder were also doing similar studies with commuters on trains and buses and people riding in airport taxis. So they asked people to either talk or sit in silence, and people reported more positivity when they talked, but they predicted that they would be happier if they sat in silence. We also looked at predictions in the Starbucks study, actually, and it's not that people were thinking that it would be really awful to talk to the barista, but they do underestimate the extent of the benefits from having a little chat. More recently, this similar effect has been replicated by Gul Günaydın and her colleagues in Turkey. And they were looking at students who took a shuttle bus. They parked their car quite far from campus and they would take a bus to campus. And they found that students reported a larger mood improvement when they expressed good wishes or gratitude to the shuttle bus driver as opposed to not speaking to the driver. So, talking to strangers makes people happy, which is fantastic because when we're not locked in our homes to avoid a pandemic, many of us cross paths with strangers every day. So this is a readily available source of happiness. But, there's always a but, people tend to underestimate the benefits. So I've been spending a lot of time recently trying to figure out exactly what people are afraid of. What do people think is going to happen if they talk to a stranger? And over the years, I've been examining different kinds of worries or fears that people have. And I've concluded that the following are some of the many things that people are afraid of. So people are worried that they're not going to enjoy the conversation or not like their partner. They worry that they or their partner won't have the skills needed to keep the conversation going and avoid the dreaded awkward silences. And people worry about how their partner is judging them. So they worry that their partner won't like them. And when talking to a stranger involves actually approaching a stranger as well, this might include the fear of rejection. So recently, Erica Boothby and I studied people's concerns in a recent mini meta-analysis of 7 studies with more than 2,000 participants. We had one vignette study, which was just hypothetical conversations, but in 6 of the 7 studies, people made predictions, actually had a conversation, and then reported on how the conversation had gone. In some of those studies, people actually had to approach a stranger in the wild and start a conversation, whereas in other ones, we arranged for them to talk to a stranger in the lab. And finally, one study was conducted at a How to Talk to Strangers workshop. So what I'm going to show you is a graph with the 6 categories of fears that I just mentioned along the x-axis. And then on the y-axis, you'll see the meta-analyzed effect size of the difference between the predictions and the experiences. So in other words, how big is the difference between what people think is going to happen and what actually happens? And as you can see, according to the rules of thumb for interpreting Cohen's D, these are generally large to very large effect sizes. So the takeaway here is that people worry before talking to a stranger, but when they report back after actually doing it, they admit that the conversation went better than they expected. And not just a little better, a lot better. And they have to admit that the things they worried about happen a lot less often than they anticipated. So the next question that comes to mind, probably for many of us, is, okay, can we reduce people's fears? Is there a way to overcome them so that people can enjoy the benefits of talking to strangers? Now, you might think that having some tips would be helpful. Journalists are always asking me for tips. They want to hear things like, talk about something you have in common, or compliment their dog or their baby. But when we put this to the test, we found that tips only helped a little bit. So it affected some of people's fears, but a lot of those fears still remained. So another thing we tried was just to give people a little bit of practice. You'd think if people just had a pleasant conversation, that they would expect the next conversation to go well too. And that did happen. So people did have more positive expectations immediately after having a pleasant conversation, but their fears were still higher than their recent pleasant experience warranted. And I think that's because it's hard for us to generalize. It's easy to think, well, just because I had a nice chat with the dog walker, I mean, I don't know who this bus driver is. How do I know if I'm going to have a nice chat with them too? So although having a single pleasant conversation doesn't fully calibrate people's expectations, we have found more recently that repeated practice helps. So in one of our studies, people played a scavenger hunt game on their phone. And every day for a week, participants had to choose at least one mission from a list that included things like find someone who's drinking a coffee or find someone who's wearing a hat. In the experimental condition, participants were asked to find a person matching the description and actually start a conversation with that person out in the real world. In the control condition, participants were asked to simply observe people and not actually start a conversation with them. And mostly what I'm going to show you is just looking at the talkers themselves. So at the start of each day, people predicted how competent they would feel during their conversations with strangers on that day. And so that will be the blue line. After they had their conversations, they reported how competent they had actually been, and that's the pink line. And what you can see is that on each of the 5 days of our study, talkers reported feeling more competent than they had predicted. On each of the 5 days of the study, participants also reported being rejected less often than they anticipated. And indeed, they were rejected very infrequently, less than 10% of the time, even though they literally were out in the world approaching complete strangers. And importantly, the gap between the predictions and the experiences got smaller over time for both rejection and competence. So in other words, after having several conversations with strangers, as opposed to just a single one, people's fears about future conversations were quite well aligned with their recent experiences. So practice really might make perfect when it comes to taming your fears about talking to strangers. So talking to strangers makes people happy, but people underestimate the benefits and they're more worried than they need to be. Tips don't really help too much, but practice, especially repeated practice, seems to help reduce the fears. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time now talking about how I think all this might relate to the idea of well-doing. So far I've talked about benefits for the self. So I've showed you evidence that people who talk to strangers benefit from well-being benefits. So they're in a better mood and they feel more connected to other people. Just speculating, I haven't tested, but another benefit that I can imagine is empathy. So when you talk to different people, it broadens your perspective. And some of our participants in the scavenger hunt said things that sort of tapped into this. So one person said, every day we walk past people, but never understand the battles that they are facing. So talking to people throughout this study allowed me to understand who they are and why. And another participant said, I found that you can't judge people by their appearance. Everyone has his or her own story. So this is something for future research maybe. But the benefits of talking to strangers aren't limited to one party. So although you benefit if you talk to a stranger, actually your partner benefits as well. So after I ran my study at Starbucks, people asked me all the time, what about the barista? Did they enjoy these conversations as well? And anecdotally, baristas actually told me that they enjoy these kind of conversations and it makes the shift go faster. Also anecdotally, there have been times when talking to a stranger has made a huge difference to me. So when I started at a new job or a new hobby and I had someone welcome me, it's incredibly impactful. And also when a stranger smiles at me at the park, this can be enough to help me break out of a negative thought spiral. But I tested this at the Tate Modern Art Gallery in London. So when you walk into the Tate, there is a huge open space called the Turbine Hall. And this is an exhibit called Empty Lot, which was on display in 2015, 2016. This is an overhead view. If you visit the Tate, there are lots of friendly volunteers there who are ready to answer your questions, but most of them will wait for you to approach them. They won't approach you because they don't want to intrude. So we ran a project on the bridge, which you can see in the foreground of this picture, which is the vantage point from which most visitors would view the exhibit. And we tested whether visitors would enjoy a chat with a volunteer or whether they would maybe find it intrusive. After all, maybe visiting a museum is meant to be a reflective personal experience. So this project was called Talking Point. And during each session, a pair of volunteers would work together and take on one of two roles. So there was a talker, in this case, the lady on the left, who we'll call Julie, and her job is to approach visitors and have a chat with them. And you could see her chatting with the visitor in this picture on the right. The second person was the survey collector. So that's the lady with the clipboard. We'll call her Lynn, and she'll keep her eye on Julie's conversation. And her job is basically to nab that man in the photo and ask him if he'll fill out a survey after the conversation. And she also asked other visitors that hadn't had a conversation to fill out some surveys as well. And so the two volunteers would do this for an hour and then they'd swap. And the volunteers really liked the talking in the end, but they did not like collecting surveys. And our research question was, if visitors had a chat with a volunteer, how would it affect their experience? So remember, it's kind of the opposite of the Starbucks study. In the Starbucks study, participants initiated the conversation, and in the Tate study, the volunteers initiating it with them. But the results were consistent. So as we found in the Starbucks study, visitors to the Tate experienced more positive affect, though not less negative affect, when they had a chat with a volunteer. And also consistently, they felt a greater sense of connection. And these feelings extended to the exhibit, to the Tate, to other people at the exhibit, and just people in general, although some of the effects were stronger than others. So talking to strangers doesn't just have benefits for the person initiating the conversation, but also their partner, similar kinds of benefits. There we go. And I should mention that Nick Epley and Juliana Schroeder, also in one of their studies looking at commuters, found benefits for both conversation partners as well. So the talker and the talkie, if you will. But I think the positive impact might stretch even further. And I'd like to propose that it's possible that talking to strangers even has benefits for society. So this is something I've started to look at quite recently. So I ran a study during COVID, during the first lockdown, March and April last year. And my original intention was to compare data to what I'd gotten from these same people pre-COVID. So I asked people to predict how it would feel to talk to a stranger. But I quickly realized that it's not really a fair comparison because you can't really, at the time, you couldn't really approach somebody and start a conversation with them. And approaching someone online is sort of different. So I didn't end up doing that comparison, but I did ask people to predict what it would be like to talk to a stranger online. And at the end of the survey, I asked people, do you really want to do it? And the majority of people said, sure. And so I basically sent them each other's contact information, asked them to arrange their own call using whatever tool they wanted to. And after having that conversation, to fill out a survey. So we got a decent number of people who followed through all of these steps. So essentially we asked people to make predictions about what it would be like to talk to a stranger online. And then I just wanted to mention it's several days later when they actually had these conversations and then reported back on their experience. And we asked at both time points 3 items about general trust in other people. And these were taken from the European Social Survey. We also asked 4 items about how benevolent they believe people are in general. So maybe this has some links back to Mila's talk. And so what we found was that after talking to a stranger, which by the way, on average, people talked for 40 minutes, so a really long time, participants reported feeling more trusting of other people and believed that other people were more benevolent. Now, of course, you might say, but Gillian, you have self-selection issues. These are people who chose to have a conversation. I kind of think that that works against us, because if we do have kind of super social or brave people, then I would expect that they would have smaller pre-post differences. So this was a change immediately after a single conversation with a stranger, but we also happened to include 1 item assessing trust of strangers in our scavenger hunt study. So earlier I showed you data from the short daily surveys, but participants also completed longer surveys at the start of the study, at the end of the study, so after a week of talking to strangers, and then again a week after the study ended. And so what you'll see is the treatment condition in orange. I apologize, the font is small. I'm not an R expert. So the treatment condition is in orange. Those are the people that actually spoke to strangers. And the control condition is in gray. So these are people who observed but didn't talk to strangers. And what you can see is that trust in others increased over the course of the study, about half a point on a 7-point scale, and it remained higher even a week after the study ended. But interestingly, this was true both in the treatment condition when participants spoke to strangers and in the control condition when participants simply observed strangers. And there was no difference between the 2 conditions at any of the time points. So as in the Zoom study, talking to strangers increased trust in others, but it seems that simply paying attention to other people might also have benefits on its own. So, benefits for society. I showed you some data about trust and belief in the benevolence of others. And one other thing I just wanted to briefly mention, sort of a more speculative thing since we're doing that, is I'd like to think that in theory, talking to strangers could also have an effect on prejudice. Now there's a huge body of research on the contact hypothesis and how having friends with an outgroup member can reduce people's prejudice. But it's really hard to become friends with people, in group or out group, right? It takes a long time. It's a complicated process. And one thing that can go wrong is that it's easy to sort of write off one person as being an exception. So we can do subtyping. So I would hope that talking to a stranger from an out group should have a positive effect too. Conversations with strangers, like I've shown you, are generally pleasant. So conversations with an out group stranger, I would hope would be pleasant as well. And talking to strangers is a really low stakes situation. People can just have a chat, they can walk away. It's not a very threatening situation. And so to the extent that people could have multiple conversations with outgroup strangers, as they did in our scavenger hunt study, I would hope that the same mechanisms would work and people would start to see a pattern. And that way they couldn't really subtype if they had pleasant conversations with several outgroup members. So talking to a hot dog lady inspired me to do this research. In the course of doing this research, I've made it a habit to talk to strangers on a regular basis. I feel like I should walk the walk if I'm doing this research. So I've shown you data, but these findings are also supported by my personal experiences. So I believe that talking to strangers makes you feel good. I also strongly believe that it's a pro-social act that makes your partner feel good and gives them the gift of belonging. And that's something I'm trying to be more conscious of and go out of my way to talk to people who might especially benefit from this gift. And finally, I think talking to strangers can change how you see other people, making the world feel a bit safer and kinder. So as Mike alluded to before I started speaking, I'd encourage you to try it out. There's a casual socializing in Gathertown just after this session, after a little break. So I encourage you to come say hi to me or someone else, and I assure you that it's likely to go much better than you expect. So I just wanted to thank my funders and collaborators, and of course, the now famous hot dog lady. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thanks so much for such a great talk. And we've got a good amount of time for questions here, so. Okay, yeah, Christian.
Hello, Gillian. Thanks for this interesting, great talk. I just wondered, is there a minimum time people need to speak to each other? And if not, what is your experience in terms of how long is the average conversation normally?
I mean, in many of my studies, so I've run a combination of lab studies and field studies. So in the lab studies, I usually sort of specify how long people should talk for. And, you know, usually in the 3 to 5 minute period, because I've always been nervous about what would happen if I asked people to speak for longer than that. But there's been recent research showing that maybe 10 minutes is sort of the sweet spot, that things actually change after 10 minutes. And a study that I'm just kicking off, we're going to ask people to speak for 15 minutes. I was personally really surprised with the study I ran on Zoom about how long strangers were happy to talk to each other. So like I said, on average, they spoke for 40 minutes, which was a really long time. They predicted that they would speak for 14 minutes. So it was a huge difference between what people thought would feel comfortable and what actually ended up feeling comfortable. If you think about how minimal it can be, I mean, the Starbucks study, it was, you know, just a chat as people were buying coffee. So it's, you know, it could be just a few words here and there. And I think it's just, you know, having that moment of connection and shared humanity that makes the difference.
But can I follow up into, would you say the longer the conversation goes, let's say from a few seconds to 10 minutes, that really makes a difference in the positive effect? I
mean, with the Starbucks study, we see the positive affect, the effect on positive affect after just, you know, those few sentences. But I guess I'm alluding to some research that isn't published yet by other people than me, and I'm desperately trying to remember exactly what they found right now. But they found, like, at the you know, after the 10-minute mark, that certain things became that something changed at that point. So I don't know. I shouldn't have said that because I can't attest to it. That's not something I've looked at it, and, you know, I haven't looked at how long they speak for and how that affects things. But sorry, unsatisfying answer to your question, I'm afraid.
Okay, next we have Marina.
Hi, Marina.
Hi,
look at the sunshine where you are.
It's nice today. Thank you, Gillian, for such a wonderful talk. I had a question about the museum study. And I wondered if the people approached only individuals who were there by themselves, or also people who were there, like, with others, and would that make a difference?
Right. We didn't give them any instructions on who to approach, but we did sort of ask them at the end of the study, you know, did you come to any conclusions about what kinds of people are easy to approach? Or, you know, because it's hard with volunteers, you know, it wasn't trained research assistants. These were actual volunteers at the Tate. So we couldn't, do any kind of randomization or anything. But they definitely did not just approach people who were there on their own, because I remember reading stories about how they would approach, someone who was there with their grandchildren, or, couples and things like that. So they approached a whole range of people, and you could see, the sample size was quite large. It was about 300 people in that condition. So, it was a wide range of people, but I'm sure they did probably get to the point where they thought, oh, that person looks like they'd be good to talk to, or maybe I won't talk to that person. So it's hard to know what effect that would have.
Okay, so we actually had a question come through on the chat, so I'm going to ask that one next. And it actually relates to something that I was wondering about earlier today. So the question is, if you've looked at the effect of sociocultural differences on the fear of talking to strangers. And I was also wondering that today in the context of, I might expect a very drastic difference in, for example, North Americans in their fears and expectations versus people from like former Soviet bloc, and especially the older generation in those countries. And maybe Mila has something to say about that as well, or Marina. Yeah.
I haven't done any cross-cultural studies. I can say that, all the places that I've done this research, I've heard lots of stories of people saying, well, people in my country are no good at this, but maybe people in that country are better at it. And then I've talked to people who are from that country, and they say, well, no, we're not any good at that either. So there does seem to be a kind of general sense in many, many places that, we are not so good at talking to strangers. In terms of which specific things people worry about, I wouldn't be surprised if there are some cultural differences, especially given that I've looked at sort of fears, individual fears, but then also fears about how other people are judging you. And so, it might work differently in different cultures. But even, I've just studied this in highly individualistic cultures. And even then, people seem to worry more about the other person than they worry about themselves. So people are more worried that the other person, their partner, is going to enjoy the conversation than they are worried about themselves enjoying the conversation. So I think that's kind of interesting. That's all I got for you. I get that question all the time, and I really need to get cracking on some cross-cultural research.
Sorry. Mila, did you have something to ask or to add?
Yes, first of all, thank you for a great talk. I really enjoyed your research, and I've read some papers before, but some of the things are new. My question is kind of related actually to what was asked, kind of more generally about individual differences, those, cultural differences, personality, like proneness to anxiety. I know that sometimes like some people just feel so anxious about talking to others. So if you looked at any of those, I was wondering.
Yeah, so I used to collect data, use, the big 5 data using the TIPI. But over time, I've also included like a specific measure of interaction anxiety, which always correlates really strongly with extroversion and seems a little more specific to the exact thing that I'm looking at. So I kind of tend to look at that a bit more than the big 5 these days. But that definitely correlates with fears. So people who report more interaction anxiety are basically, report more of all the different kinds of fears. But it seems that the trend that I see in my data is that all these things might affect people's predictions of talking to strangers, but there's not really anything going on when you look at the experiences. So it really seems like even if you're highly introverted and anxious, it doesn't mean that you can't enjoy a conversation with a stranger. And when I talk about this recently with journalists, there's been a lot of media attention lately because of COVID, everybody's thinking about, the kinds of people, these kind of interactions that we haven't really been able to have many of. And now that we're getting back out there, are we going to be okay? Do we forget how to do it? And where was I going with this? Oh, yes. I just try to tell everybody, I'm very much an introvert, and yet this is something that I have grown to really enjoy and benefit from. And I think it's just really important to say that, because I think there is this perception that it's really only a thing that, those extroverts can do. And I don't think that's true at all.